Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another beautiful Wednesday afternoon. I hope you guys are enjoying your week so far. I hope you have had a good one, even though we're all still in lockdown. Today, we are going to be covering the first episode of How to Score for Strings. This is going to be at least a two-parter, and we're going to go over how to actually start using all your string instruments together now that we've gone over the characteristics of all of the individual instruments. This is a very broad topic, and it takes a lot of practice and experience outside of just all the knowledge I'm about to share with all of you to completely understand, but everyone has to start somewhere, so let's get right into it. To start, let's quickly identify all the instruments that we're going to be working with today. We've already covered all of them individually in their own videos that break down their different characteristics. But here's what we're going to be working with today. We're going to be working with double bass, cello, viola, and the violin. Now, the violin actually has two different separate sections when you're working with a string orchestra. So today we're going to be working with violins 1 and violins 2. It will also be important to note that this will not include separate plucked string instruments that are in an orchestra, such as a harp or a guitar, as we will be covering how to use those in future videos. Now, the string section is definitely the most recognizable part of any orchestra, in my personal opinion, and it has definitely been popularized in more recent times with the widespread use of virtual libraries. However, just because it's popular does not mean that anything that you do with the string library will sound good. There are some things you will need to know about how to use these instruments and how to write for them. The first few things you're going to want to know when writing for strings is how to get your arrangement to sound professional. Now, a lot of composers spend hours and hours of their life dedicated to this study, weeks upon months. And in this regard, I'm going to show you a few general guidelines to follow that'll help get you started in your studying. Firstly, you're going to want to have each instrument carry its own voice. They're going to all want to have their own line. Simply doubling everything up in octaves is not an effective way to write music, and it starts to sound very glued together when everything has the same line. If a lot of instruments are playing the same line, it doesn't sound cohesive, it doesn't sound interesting. The music that you write with that kind of method gets very boring very fast. You'll also want each string instrument to be heard equally. This is somewhat of a mixing thing when you mix your music, but it is also predominantly in how you write and the expression that you put on with your string libraries. And this can apply just as much to chamber or quartet string ensembles as does to full symphony orchestra ensembles. There is an aspect of foreground, middle ground, and background that needs to be looked into, which we will explore in part 2, but it is still very important that all the strings are heard equally, as they are an extremely homogeneous section. Allowing your entire string section to be heard fully makes it a lot more rich, makes it a lot more full. Your strings will just sound better. And to prove this, I actually have written up an example that we will explore. So as you can see on the screen here, I've got all 5 different sections of the string ensemble. I've got violins 1, 2, violas, cellos, and double bass. I've just taken them and I've written out this very short piece where each instrument follows its own line and can be heard equally. Let's just take a quick listen to it and go from there. This does sound like something straight out of a music class that you'd take in high school, but it works. It already sounds cohesive. It sounds like real instruments are playing it because each instrument is following its own line, with the exception, as you can see here, of the cellos and double bass. That's primarily because the double bass is commonly used to double the cello an octave lower. When you think of writing 4 voices with strings, it's normally 2 voices in the violins, 1 in the viola, and 1 in the cello, because you have violin 2, violin 1, viola, and cello. And then the double bass adds in a lot of the low end, adds in a lot of weight, doubles the cello, where your cello will actually play the main bass line. Now, of course, this piece doesn't sound epic, it doesn't sound beautiful. However, if you're starting to learn how to write with strings, something like this is an amazing piece of groundwork. If you can write out something where you can hear each individual line on its own, then you already have a great place to start. For example, we can obviously hear the main melody, which is played in the second violins. However, it's not very hard to hear the underlying harmonies mixed in, such as the first violins and the viola. And then finally, we add in the cello and the bass. Of course, this isn't mixed. There's a little bit of volume changes that need to be made if you wanted this to be used as a professional score. However, being able to write cohesively, being able to make sure that each instrument has its own line, each instrument has its own voice, is a very important part of learning how to write for strings. And it adds in so much more richness when everything can be heard. Another thing you want to keep in mind is you want to take advantage of each instrument's colorful characteristics wherever possible. As mentioned in the previous individual videos we did on violas, violins, cellos, and basses, each instrument has different audible characteristics in each range. For example, the violins in their lower ranges might sound a little weaker, or the cellos in their middle ranges sound very warm and full and rich. And characteristics like these are what you want to take advantage of when learning how to write and explore with your string instruments. Building off this fact, it is actually not uncommon for professional scores of instruments to cross their lines. For example, cellos might play higher than violas, or the violas might play higher than the violins. Taking those tools and using them creatively is a great way to come up with new ideas and learn how to explore with your string instruments more effectively. For example, let's take a look at the second piece that I wrote up, where I actually didn't use the second section of the violins, but I did combine the first violins, the violas, the cellos, and the double bass. And the main focus on this particular demo is the cellos. And you can see, this is the cello line. It actually starts lower and crosses up above the violas, actually almost gets to the top where the violins are, and then kind of plays in the middle range. It's a very, very short motif. I didn't put hours of work into this, but you can already hear where something like that can take you. You can have your cellos play very expressive melody lines that cross up above the violas and even sometimes above the violins, depending on how you write and what you're writing. And you can use those ideas to further expand on your creativity. Studying other pieces of music is also a great way to show you new techniques that you can use in your own writing. The main theme is never restricted to being just played in the first violins. It can be played in any instrument on the string section, so long as you accompany it properly and your melody, of course, stays in the foreground of your music. It is also not uncommon at all for the second violins or the viola to take over the main melody other than the cello, due to those instrument characteristics we mentioned and how you want your music to be portrayed and what emotions or qualities you're trying to put forth. You can even write your main motif or melody line in the double bass. It is a much more uncommon choice due to the instrument's range, where it sits in the orchestra. However, I personally find that it sounds amazing in solo sections. It works great if you're looking for a darker mood, a darker theme, and it also accompanies very well with woodwinds, in my personal opinion. Most times, however, the double bass is used to directly double the cello, as we already explored, as that gives it a much deeper tone, gives your orchestra a lot of weight, and you can use this to actually make your music feel lighter, because once you introduce that weight and that heavy sound of the double bass doubling the cello, you can remove it in later sections of your music, and that makes it sound lighter. Using this information and playing around with a string library on your end is possibly the best way to further enforce this knowledge and techniques into your writing. However, it is important to always remain creative. In part 2, we're going to explore different techniques for writing for foreground, middle ground, and background, how you can write those out in your score and have it all sound cohesive, and that'll help get you to the next level of professional sound for your strings. Like I said, there is a lot of practice involved, and you will need to do a lot of this on your end and just learn and flesh it out with your own ears. So while you're waiting for part 2, I highly recommend you try writing out some strings on your end and see how you can make it all work together, see how you can write out their individual lines. If you've worked with 3 or 4 part harmony before, it's very, very similar. If you haven't, I recommend you check this out. And I also recommend watching the individual instrument videos if you haven't already, because that'll give you a great starting point to work on this as well. So I will see you guys next week. I hope you enjoy the rest of your week, and I hope you all get some amazing music written. If you have any questions, leave it in the comments, and I'll see you guys next week. Bye-bye.